Welcome to SAPUI5 tutorial for the beginners. So in this tutorials we are going to have a look at the different controls available in SAPUI5. Okay, so before exactly looking to this different controls available in SAPUI5. Okay, so let's have a look at the different types of elements in HTML5 or HTML I can say, right? So so let's say, so in case if you want to create an input field in HTML, so there is something called as input, or right, so yes, input. And in case if you want to create a button inside in a HTML, then obviously there is something called as button. So in case if you want to uh, let's say create a radio button, there is an element in a HTML called radio buttons, right? So in case if you want to create a checkbox, so there is an element called checkbox. In case if you want to select a drop downs, right? So there is something called as select in HTML. So in case if you want to let's say render a table, so there is a table tag in HTML. And let's say if you want to create a dialog, so then obviously you have to use some CSS files and blah blah things. In case if you want to let's say render a multi drop down, so there is something called as a select box of type multiple. So like this, there are, let's say in case if you want to create a paragraph, there is a p element available. In case if you want to create a division, there is a div tag available, right? So like this, there are different elements inside a HTML. So now, so if you come to the point of the controls available in SAP UI5. So for each and every element in a HTML, so there is a corresponding control in SAP UI5. So let's say for example, if you want to render an input, so you are going to use a input control, right? So in case if you want to render a button or a button for this particular button element in HTML, so there is a corresponding button control in SAP Wi-Fi. So in the same way, for the radio button element, so there is something called as radio button control in SAP Wi-Fi. In the same way, so for the checkbox, there is a checkbox available in here. So in the same way, in case if you want to render a drop down, so there is a select control or a drop down control available inside SAP UI5. So in case if you want to render the way how we are using a table element, so in the same way there is something called as table control in SAP UI5. So in case if you want to render a multi-select a drop down, there is something called as combo box. Okay, so in SAP UI5, in case if you want to render a paragraph, there is something called as text. Okay, in case if you want to render a division, so you can use the text, and in case with the help of div tag in HTML, you can align the elements inside that, or you can render some text inside that. So that depends on the div tag. So for that, so there is something called as hbox and vbox, to align the elements. So there are different controls. So like this, there are so many controls available in SAP UI5. So depending upon your requirements, you can use the corresponding controls in SAP UI5. Okay, so let's have a look at the documentation of SAP UI5 in here. So in case, as I told you in this, in here, that for each and every element, there is a corresponding control defined in SAP UI5. So let's go here and search for input. Okay, so sorry, so input. So if you can see here, input is some control, and if you can see here, input is there, right? So in the same way, in case if you want to render the checkboxes, so there is something called as checkbox control is available, right? So checkbox control is available. So in the same way, in case if you want to render the radio button, so there is a radio button control is available. So you can use the radio button group control to group all these particular radio buttons. In case if you want to render a table, so there is a corresponding control called table. SAP M table is there, SAP Smart table is there, SAP UI analytical table. There are different kinds of tables are available. So depending upon your requirement, you can go for using a different controls. So let's say the requirement. So I'm just specifically mentioning that the requirement, right? So that means if you are developing an application which will support the mobile and desktop, then obviously you have to use SAP M dot table, right? So that means so there are so many functionalities, the tab functionalities and everything will be supported by this. So in the same way, once you are rendering something in a mobile, so you can easily render in I can say the desktops. So let's say if you are using only developing an application, if you are developing an application only for the desktops, so then you can go for using SAP UI table. So you can use this particular table, right? So at the same time, so there is something called as list, I can say. Okay, so let me type properly. Yes, list. So that means there are so many. Let's say you are trying to render a list of employees or a list of students. So then, so there is something called as list control available. So you can list all these. You can render a list in on your web page. So with the help of list control. So right, so in the same way, let's say there is a paragraph, instead of paragraph there is a text control, as I told you, right? So text control and label control is available. See, so label control, and if you go to the control again, so there is a properties and there may be an aggregation, there may not be an aggregations. If you take this particular control, as I told you in the previous tutorial, this control does not have the aggregation. That means those are all optional. It is not mandatory that every control has an aggregation, so it is an optional. So this is an example for that, right? So like this, there are so many. In case if you want to render the text area, so then obviously there is something called as text area. In case if you want to display the dialog boxes, so there is something called as okay, dialog. So where is this? Yeah, dialog here. So there are so many different so many types of dialog boxes available. And so you see busy dialog and then dialog type, so using which you can define the dialog type as message as standard, and P13N dialog, select dialog, personal. So there are so many different kinds of dialog boxes available. So depending upon the requirements, you can use all these dialog boxes. So in the same way, in case if you want to render the popovers, there is something called as popover a control. And see here you can use different popovers are available, so you can choose the right one, and then you can use this control in your um, application, right? So this is the overview of all the controls available inside SAP UI5. So you can go ahead with all these things depending upon your requirement. So let's say in case if you want to render the anchor, anchor link, yes, so hyperlinks, let's say, so anchor bar, so we are going to use EA tag in HTML. So in here there is something called as link. So this is some meaningful text, I can say. Yeah, so like this there are so many controls available, so you can search for the appropriate control depending upon your requirement, and then you can use all these all these I can say the controls in your application. Yeah, so this is about all these things. And then let's say in case there are so much stuff, so let's say, so going further we are gonna look into all these the controls. And if you can see here, date picker is there and image is there. So this is deprecated API, so let's go for date picker. Okay, so here see, you can see this date picker in here. So like this, there is a something called as image, right? So image control, so image control, and there is something called as charts. Okay, so there are so many charts available. Okay, you can use the corresponding chart depending upon your requirements. Okay, this is, so in this tutorial we are going to have a look at the overview of the controls which are available inside SAP UI5, and then depending upon your requirement you can go ahead with using particular control. Okay, either it can be a chart, or it can be a table, or it can be a normal field, or it can be anything. Okay, so like this you can see there is something called as form. In case if you want to develop the forms, right, so there is a control called form in, sorry, there is an element called form in HTML, and in here there is a control called form. So this is a deprecated, which is belongs to commons. But if you go to SAP M, sorry, not SAP M, so it is SAP UI.layout.form. So this form you can use to create forms in your application. So that's it for this tutorial. Let's meet in the next tutorial to go to just look into how to use all these different kinds of forms. Thanks for watching.